Good afternoon, everyone. So as everyone said, my thread was the human rights thread, and I just sort of want to preface my presentation by saying this was actually quite a tall order to synthesize everything because of the great complexity of material and concepts in each course. And I think that the similarities and overlap between courses, as well as some of the differences in approach, have really proved critical to a deeper understanding of the field and practice of human rights. And each course has really provided to me various types of lenses through which to view and critique human rights. And with the title of my presentation, I really sought to encapsulate one of the biggest things that I've taken away from this course thread, which each course really helped me find by presenting a lot of pros and cons of human rights and then finding some common ground in the middle. And so although it is critical to really look at the pragmatic and ideological limitations of human rights and view human rights as deeply problematic, and there's this need to grapple with human rights as a globalizing and transnational phenomenon with potentially negative consequences, there's also this possibility for usefulness. And human rights can be utilized to work towards possible resolutions as long as human rights are deployed with caution. And so the courses I took were the Globalization of Rights, Values, and Laws in the 21st Century, which was an interdisciplinary studies course, Transnational Feminisms, a Gender and Women's Studies course, Feminist Jurisprudence, a legal studies course, and the Southern Border, which was cross-listed with ethnic studies, geography, and education. So I want to begin by talking about this particular course because I think that this course really strikes at the heart of what I took away from this course thread. We began really by looking at the history of international human rights, and the image up there you see Eleanor Roosevelt with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was completed in 1948. And so this is this idea of a universal human rights, a universal register for discussion. But then in this course, what we started doing was critiquing that idea of a universal notion of human rights. Does this mean a destruction of tradition and specificity? Is this a type of Western colonialism because these values are often originating in the West? And is this sort of a new way of civilizing the non-Western other? However, at the same time, we began to ask whether, despite these potential problems, is there something valuable in seeking basic universal human rights? And certain scholars like Michael Ignatieff would argue that yes, there is something valuable in having this basic minimal line. However, other scholars sort of push beyond that, such as Thomas Laqueur, and argue that the value of human rights is really in its ability to morph and be applicable in various ways in various contexts. And indeed, in this course, we began to ask what happens when you deploy human rights discourse in concrete situations, and how does that happen, and who is doing that? And so I just want to briefly point to two examples of scholars who really bring out that deployment of discourse in a couple of places. And one is Mark Goodale, who speaks about new modes of social resistance in Bolivia, a society in which there's a significant indigenous population, but has been very marginalized and at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And Goodale looks at this example of what's been happening in Bolivia as what he cautiously terms the triumph of human rights discourse. And he says that these grassroots indigenous social movements have mobilized human rights ideas to critique abuses carried out through economic policy in the name of individual rights, to challenge old forms of inequality and oppression, to gain a voice in politics, and to demand equality and representation in the state. But what Goodale really starts to argue is that it's not the use of universal human rights as these homogeneous normative, as expressed in these homogeneous normative instruments like the Universal Declaration, but rather the idea behind human rights and the common humanity that the idea implies. And so what's happened in Bolivia is that by transforming human rights discourse into these cultural terms that are more appropriate in the Bolivian context, human rights discourse has sort of altered the way these indigenous Bolivians see themselves and themselves in relation to others and to the social structures. And this is sort of partially culminated anyway in the election of Evo Morales, who was the first indigenous president of Bolivia. And one other example I really want to mention, there are two scholars named Margaret Keck and Catherine Kink who talk about transnational advocacy networks. And these networks place values or principled ideas at the center of their struggle for various issues, but then they seek to frame these issues to make them more comprehensible to target audiences. Which then in turn, when you're communicating with a given population about a given issue, those people in that specific place then bring new ideas and discourses and frames of meaning to the human rights discussion and to various policies that can then be utilized and then again transformed and contextualized in new places. So there's a little bibliography. It's really dense. We covered so much material. These are just a couple examples I spoke of. Now I want to move on to the transnational feminisms course, which was through Gender and Women's Studies. And we really worked to question notions of linear progress for women. What does it mean for women to progress in various areas, and who is progressing, and in what way? And we really sought to think and act across all sorts of borders, whether they be national borders or borders within societies. And we really stressed the need to look at historical and social conditions to understand trends and power relations and hierarchies. Indeed, histories and power relations as informed by colonialism, neocolonialism, development, race, class, gender, and sexual orientation are all things that impact and form societies and hierarchies. And one way to sort of look at this is what we spent a little bit of time studying, which is this term called intersectionality, which points to these multiple levels of identity. So a person may be oppressed in various ways corresponding to various aspects of identity in given moments and in given times. So a woman from Bolivia may be in Bolivia, which has experienced a history of colonization, and she may be an indigenous woman. So there are already multiple layers of her identity building up, and in given moments, oppression might be because of her gender, but at other moments it might be simply because she's an indigenous person. So it's really trying to bring out the complexity of both identity and oppression. And so we talked about human rights in this course, and these understandings of what transnational feminisms are and how we understand them has provided a lens through which to critique and find human rights as useful. And I want to just talk about one example of how human rights the discourse has been utilized in a potentially harmful fashion, and then I want to speak about one that was perhaps an example of human rights being deployed in a more successful manner. So the first example is one that I learned about through the scholar Laura Briggs, who looked at what was supposed to be this campaign of forced sterilization and abuse of reproductive technologies in Puerto Rico. And so it was assumed that a huge amount of women were being coerced or forced into sterilization, Puerto Rican women. And what happened is that US feminists saw this, or what they believed was occurring, and this narrative of forced sterilization actually made sense according to racial debates within the United States about access to birth control and sterilization and coercion. In poor communities in the United States, various women, often women of color, were being forced into sterilization. And so these US feminists looked at Puerto Rico and said, this must be what's happening there as well. However, what happened is that the US feminists did not actually look at what the Puerto Rican feminists and Puerto Rican women were saying about their situation. And what Laura Briggs has really come to discover was that although there probably was some coercion, it was not quite as large scale as these US feminists were making it out to be. And the US feminists came in and said, we look at this oppression, we need to bring human rights here. But the Puerto Rican women were saying, well, actually, the decision about being sterilized is actually more complex. It's informed by there's histories of colonialism which impacted their socioeconomic status. So the question was actually really complex. And what happened is that these US feminists became aligned with these pro-nativist, nationalist Puerto Rican activists who were arguing for a return to pre-colonization patriarchy and traditional notions of family in which women would literally reproduce the nation. And so these women's bodies became sort of pawns in this debate as to whether human rights were being carried out, but it was sort of a strange bedfellow situation that was ultimately rather harmful to the Puerto Rican women. However, I believe that we can see a number of examples of the usefulness of human rights, and one example was brought to my attention in this class looking at a scholar named Rosalinda Fregoso, who looked at Ciudad Juarez, is a border city on the US-Mexico border. It's a Mexican city in which for a number of years a high number of feminicides have been taking place. And what happens is these women just disappear and their bones appear later in the desert. And it's quite large scale, definitely in the hundreds and hundreds, and the number is not really that known. But what happened is that because this was made sort of invisible by the state and no one was really addressing this problem, a number of grassroots activist women appropriated a human rights discourse and vernacularized it to protest and create a visibility of the feminicides. In this case, they used pink crosses to represent the women. And although that might be problematic for a number of reasons, particularly with respect to what religion does in terms of re-entrenching various forms of hierarchies, this was a way that human rights discourse can be seen as flexible and able to be taken up by various people in various places to make visible their causes and to confront entities like the state. And this is just one image I want to briefly mention. It's a tobacco company advertisement in which you see the angelic white woman presenting the native other woman with the gift of tobacco, which is problematic largely, partially because tobacco probably originated where the indigenous woman is. But I sort of see it as a metaphor for looking at a human rights critique, which is human rights just a smokescreen for capitalist accumulation? And are we trying to civilize the native other with this discourse? How are we mobilizing human rights and who is doing it? That's just a brief bibliography. And so the next course I want to talk about, feminist jurisprudence through legal studies, was actually quite different from the other two courses in that it seeks to work within, or feminist legal scholars and activists seek to work within an existing framework, the law, particularly in the US in this course. And although they are seeking to use the law, these legal scholars simultaneously ask whether working within the existing frameworks, even if you're trying to modify them, is actually even a productive way about seek equality. And what's even more complex is that can legal solutions to systematic problems actually reach everyone? What is the relationship between theory and practice? And when you're putting ideas into law, does it actually work? And one thread between this course and the Gender and Women's Studies course had to do with intersectionality. And so you're looking at various, one example of this was a sexual harassment claim was developed over time particularly by Catherine McKinnon. And it is actually something people can use in court, as you probably know. But a lot of the plaintiffs, we looked at a lot of case law, and what we discovered is that a lot of the plaintiffs in sexual harassment cases were women of color. And they often lost their cases. And a lot of it had to do, what we concluded was how they were construed as these sexualized objects, which again points to the relationship between colonial powers and the colonized. And so they were sort of thought of as deserving the sexual harassment or asking for it in the workplace. And so even if you have these claims, these sexual harassment claims, is it effective for everyone and who is being left out? And the final course I want to talk about is the Southern Border, that multiple cross-listed course I mentioned before. And in this course, we really focused a lot on US-Latin America relations, especially US-Mexico relations. We talked a lot about what's happening in the US-Mexico Futures Forum, which gets a bunch of heads of state from both the UN and Mexico together to talk about issues and try to find policy solutions. And in this course, we really looked again at histories of colonialism and neocolonialism and how those really inform the relationships the US has with Latin America and how that then impacts immigration to the US from these countries. And we also looked at issues of human rights, again, as informed by those histories. And I just want to harken back because this is one of the fun ways in which courses really connect together is the examples people are talking about often overlap. And I was talking before about Ciudad Juarez and the feminicides. And in this class, we talked about how these free trade zones along the US-Mexico border, Ciudad Juarez is one of them, I believe, they're places that really cater to the business interests, particularly of multinational corporations, but also the US. And they're zones in which the laws of neither country apply. So the question then becomes, well, how are the rights of people, labor rights, human rights, how are they being enforced? And the answer is they're not. I mean, as seen by these feminicides, people are just, the abuses are rampant, and no one will protect these women because they're not in their jurisdiction. So that's a question of, well, if human rights is supposedly universal and covering everyone, how come without these states protecting them, there's nothing done to protect them? And one final example I just wanted to bring up has to do with genocide in Guatemala. We looked at one of Professor Mons's books called Paradise in Ashes. And in Guatemala, there had been a very entrenched social hierarchy, largely informed by histories of colonialism, in which the indigenous Mayans were at the bottom. And these Mayans tried to find a way to find new land so that they could subsist, essentially. And this was deemed threatening to international business interests, which meant that the genocide it happened without anyone intervening. And again, I think that really demonstrates this intersection of issues of class and histories of colonialism and neocolonialism. So really what I want to highlight, as I hope you've picked up on, is that each course and these courses together really try to get you to look at the complexity of each situation, the complexity of the critiques of human rights, and the complexity of how human rights can be useful. So they're both problematic and valuable is really the conclusion I've drawn, which is my own work is in this area, and so I feel that it's very important to draw out the usefulness as well as spending a lot of time with these critiques. And I do believe that if you pay attention to complexity and context and who is speaking when and in what moment, human rights can be fluid and dynamic across all sorts of borders. And to ultimately conclude, I just want to mention a little bit of my own research. I think that these courses and building upon each other really ultimately allowed me to be able to complete my senior honors thesis, which was about the use of forensic evidence and forensic technologies to identify the victims of human rights violations in Chile during Pinochet's dictatorship. And I wanted to close with this because I think that this is sort of exemplifies a great use of human rights, in that ever since the end of the dictatorship and before, the relatives of the disappeared persons had been saying, we need resolution, we need the remains of our loved ones back. And finally, the response is happening, and it's governmental. And there's a government campaign to actually get these relatives of the disappeared to come forward and give their blood so that they can use DNA matching technologies to identify the human remains. And so I think this really exemplifies a power structure, critique it as we might, recognizing what the people are saying. And these are often marginalized communities who are finally getting a voice in the debate and are working towards resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much.